Can you repeat, please?
And we're live.
Perfect.
Good morning, everybody. Happy damn Friday. It's Grade School Friday. I'm psyched to be with you guys. Hope everyone's doing great out there. Hope you guys are having an awesome week. I hope you're in some sort of pleasurable holiday season vibes and that your normal tempo of work and life is shifting a little bit with the season and that you're getting to maybe do some fun stuff, do some stuff on the side. I think I mentioned to you guys last week, maybe I didn't, I can't recall, but I'm really happy because I just bought a little Macintosh Plus computer like I had when I was a kid. It's the computer I learned how to program on. I just bought one and threw away 600 perfectly good dollars on it, and my wife was a good sport and didn't give me too much of a hard time about it. But I got to tell you, that's like the best 600 bucks I've spent all year. I'm having a blast playing around with this thing, and it's got nothing to do with anything useful, but I just like it. So that's my prescription for you guys today. Before we get into any color grading stuff at all, go treat yourself to something that has no practical utility, but you just like. Go enjoy yourself. Go take some downtime. Refill your gas tank. That's the best gift that you can give to your clients when you come back in the new year for 2022, which is going to be awesome. And that's a pretty good segue into what I want to talk about today, which is dealing with difficult clients. And we're also going to talk about dealing with difficult grades. So as usual, I've got some thoughts that have kind of like stacked up in my head as I've been thinking about this subject this week. I'm going to share those with you guys, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. Definitely want to give priority to any of you guys who've had questions or tough experiences with clients or grades. And then if we have time to do some freestyle at the end, I'm happy to do that as well. My good buddy Raphael is here with me. He's going to help me get everyone's questions answered, keep us all organized. So we're ready to rock and roll. We got the group assembled. I got my grade school gang. I got my moderator in place, and we're going to have a great session. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about dealing with difficult clients and difficult grades. Two separate but often intertwined things. Let's start by talking about dealing with difficult clients. Now, what do I mean when I say difficult clients? It's all a matter of perspective at the end of the day, isn't it? And that's going to be one of our themes that we'll return to today. Dealing with difficult clients, that's a relative term. It depends on what the worst client you ever had in your room is and the client that you're used to having in the room or in the Zoom room or virtual session, as is probably more likely today with the current state of the world. But it's all relative, right? And that's maybe a decent theme to sort of like throw onto the dartboard right away. It's like, that's a relative term, and what you are framing in your mind at a particular moment is like, oh my goodness, like these people are so difficult. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's all about your frame of reference. It's all about your lens, right? With that said, let's talk about what we can do when let's design a bit of a hypothetical situation. We're in a room, we're doing a grade, and we're just having trouble communicating and getting on a positive wavelength with the client. The stuff they're asking us for doesn't make sense, or it seems to conflict with other things that they've asked us for, or they seem not to value our time. Maybe they're condescending, maybe they're distracted. There's a million ways that a client interaction or collaboration can be difficult interpersonally, right? So what are some broad principles that we can use for addressing these situations when they come about? All right. The first one I'm going to give you, this is like, I feel like kind of an old guy suggestion that I apply in all areas of my life, that if you had told it to me as a young person, it would have just made me mad. And I would have said, that's ridiculous. Here's a good prescription for you in all areas where you feel you are experiencing difficulty or strife, or you're having trouble accomplishing or achieving something. Lower your expectations. That's right. You heard me right. Lower your expectations. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Sometimes the problem with a difficult client experience or with any circumstance we are calling difficult is we have arbitrarily set expectations that are far too high for what we're doing. So that's the first thing you're going to do the moment that you feel the back of your neck bristle at some comment that a client makes, or you notice like they're leaving the room for the third time and you just got the session started and you're trying to get this thing done. Just lower your expectations, because the truth is anything you could characterize as difficult when it comes to working with a client, it's difficult to the extent that it diverges from your expectation, right? So if the client walks out of the room for the third time in the first hour, you perceive that as difficult if you do perceive it as difficult, because your expectation is that the client is going to come in, sit down, and give you their full attention, right? So that's step number one. When you're working with clients, lower your expectations. If things are getting difficult, maybe your bar is too high. And even if it's not, what that's going to do is depressurize the situation a little bit. Because if you're not careful, the most likely thing that your client is going to experience from you when you are perceiving something as difficult and you are trying to sort of like manhandle things back into a good place, the most likely thing that your client is going to pick up on from that is a sense of pressure or a sense of frustration. And you don't really want to put that stuff into the air, especially if the situation is already less than positive, less than ideal. So lower those expectations, and you want to get into a mode that is really beneficial to live in throughout your collaborations, which we've talked about a lot in the last couple months here in grade school. That's to get into an exploratory collaborative mode, move out of being so result oriented and move out of the pressure to get this grade done in the next 4 hours or before the day is done. Yeah, that stuff is there, but I kind of gave you guys this anecdote a little while ago. To the extent that we're all good at what we do, and we spend a ton of time here on Grade School talking about how to get good at what we do, the actual turning of the knobs and understanding what we need to do to make the image look better than it came in and best represent our client's creative intent. If we know how to do that, okay, if we take that seriously and we're diligent about getting there, like everyone who's here with me this morning does, and like I know I do in my practice, the truth is it may feel, oh my goodness, how are we going to get this done? But the reality is, I'll put it to you this way. I have never, in my 10 plus years of working as a colorist with all kinds of different clients, all kinds of different projects, all kinds of different skill level as I've continued to get better and better as time goes on, I have never once not delivered a project. You're going to get it done. Just relax. Just depressurize the situation a little bit by unburdening yourself from high expectations and a lucid frame of what your results need to look like and when they need to come about. Just lower those expectations. When you do, you can replace what you did fill the room with prior, which is these like ironclad expectations and the anxiety of them looking like they're not going to be met. And you can replace it with more of an exploratory and curious mindset. And this leads us right into our next principle when it comes to working with clients effectively. And that is that it's kind of like if you ever hear any great actor talk about playing the bad guy in a movie, they'll all give you that same sort of what now has become almost a cliched line that they're like, well, the bad guy doesn't think they're the bad guy, at least not in a movie worth watching. The bad guy is just going about his or her agenda in his or her particular way, and they feel justified in it. So in the same way, it's helpful to explicitly remind yourself when you're in the room and you're with a difficult client, quote unquote, that client doesn't think they're difficult. They're not trying to be difficult. They have an agenda in mind and they're doing their very best to accomplish that agenda. So your goal, your role as the colorist is to figure out what is that agenda and how can I get it there and how can I show them that they actually don't need to be difficult. They don't need to use the strategies that they're using right now in order to get their agenda met. I'm going to be there to meet them. I'm going to listen really well and I'm going to be able to accomplish it for them. So lower those expectations, diffuse, depressurize the situation a little bit, relieve yourself of the need for it to go a certain way in a certain amount of time, and get into an exploratory mode and try to figure out, okay, where are they coming from? Some great questions to ask are like, what's your experience been with color in the past? Try to tease out, have they had a tough experience with a colorist in the past, or a colorist who didn't listen or didn't give them what they want? Or after the fact, they realized, oh my God, I thought the grade was okay in the room, but it looked terrible a week later. Those are all telling things for us to uncover and discover. They're only going to happen if we move into that softer, more exploratory, more curious frame of mind. And we don't take the bait of like, oh, the energy's getting tense and tight and demanding, and I'm going to sort of respond in kind and start to become a little like defensive and reactionary. Just lower the temperature, depressurize the situation a little bit. So those are some broad ideas about dealing with difficult clients. Remember, the client doesn't think they're difficult. They're just trying to get their goals accomplished. And if you can enter into it with the right attitude, you'll have no trouble discovering what those goals are. People are very transparent as long as we are not like clouding our vision with our own frustration or anger or anxiety. That'll be principle number one. And the even broader one from there is just lower your expectations, because difficult is a relative term. And remember, we have cool jobs. Being a colorist is a cool job, or whether you're a colorist or any other post-production professional, it beats the hell out of digging ditches. It beats the hell out of a lot of other jobs that a lot of people have to do, or a lot of other struggles that a lot of people are forced to confront every day. We have it pretty good as creative professionals. It's a cool job. It's a good job. We're abundant. And we just want to remind our clients of that as well. Like, hey, whatever you need, lay it on me. I'm listening. I'm here to serve you. And the strategies they're employing that may be a little less than ideal, you can show them rather than try to tell them or insist to them that they actually don't need to use those strategies in order to get the best possible result out of you and your collaboration. Okay. General ideas about how to deal with a quote unquote difficult client. Let's talk about difficult grades for a moment, because difficult grades come up too. Difficult grades often are a result of a difficult client, and one tends to feed off of the other. It's pretty rare that you're going to have a grade you would call difficult, but a client who you feel like is super open, super collaborative, super appreciative of your work. It's just that what they're asking for is so hard. Usually these things intertwine, right? But let's say that we are more on the side of like, all right, I understand what you're asking for. It's just that with the footage I have and with my skill as a colorist, I'm having trouble. I'm having trouble getting there. First of all, there's the first principle that I would point out here is, let's take a little bit of ego out of the situation. That's okay. That's okay that that's happening, and you don't need to conceal that from your client. Your client may or may not be aware of this. They usually are. That like, hey, this job that you're working on with me, this is your whole world. Do you know what my relationship to this job is? It's one of 3 that I'm going to do today. It's one of a dozen that I'm probably going to do this week. And it's not like any other project that I've ever done. There's going to be curveballs. There's going to be unique things in any project we tackle. And if we are carrying the subtext in our back pocket that like, I'm here to respond and adapt to new projects and learn from those projects, and I don't expect myself to have all the answers and all the solutions ready-made for those new challenges and projects, then that subtext can come across, and you don't have to feel the need to conceal it from your client like, gosh, I have to tell you, I'm not exactly sure how to tackle this. That's something that I'll state out loud all the time. I'll push back from my chair and say, wow, that's a really interesting direction that you're giving me, and I really want to think about the best way to bring that about. It is okay to not have all the answers, okay? So that, once again, is going to accomplish the task of making that difficult grade a little bit less difficult, and that really relates to the principle that we talked about with difficult clients that's going to work really well for difficult grades. Lower those expectations. Stop expecting yourself to have the perfect answer to any and all challenges and requests that are put to you that you can apply equally well to any and all footage on any day. That's not realistic. That's not reasonable. And if that's your expectation, then it's no wonder that you find grades, that you're finding a particular grade difficult from time to time, because that's just the way that the dice are going to roll from time to time. So 2 principles that we can apply to difficult grades is we can take a little bit of ego out of the situation, take a little bit of that ridiculous presumption on our part or our client's part that we would magically have an instant solution to any and all creative challenges or technical challenges that come into our color bay. And right along with that would be, once again, lower those expectations. Just relax and say like, hey, you know what? I'm going to let go just a little bit of this super vivid image of a super specific outcome for just a little while. And instead, I'm going to engage with the process and I'm going to enjoy it. And I'm going to remember that me not knowing quite what to do when I'm given this note right away, that's not a barrier to the result. That is the result. That's the process. That's what creative collaboration is. That's what making art is. Yeah, we got to be time efficient. Yeah, we're expected to know what the heck we're doing, but we do know what the heck we're doing. Every one of you guys who's here with me in this room cares about knowing what they're doing. So you need to worry a little bit less about being found out and the so-called imposter syndrome that we all can suffer from time to time. You're not an imposter. You care deeply about doing good work, and that's going to be evident to your client as long as you're not betraying some ill-placed sense of guilt that like, oh boy, I'm a fraud, and now they're going to find out because I didn't instantly know how to address a note I've literally never gotten before. That's just not reasonable. And again, I wish I could rewind and go back to the Cullen of the past and remind him of the things I'm telling you guys now, because I wasted a lot of time earlier in my career, like trying to hide the fact that I'm like, oh, I don't exactly know what I should do about that. And it's worth noting, kind of on a tangent on that subject, those are in fact great opportunities, great collaborative opportunities. And you may find that, let's, sort of like cook up the worst hypothetical we can think of, a difficult client and a difficult grade in a difficult situation. This interval where a client says, I want you to do this, is actually potentially a really good opportunity if you say, gosh, kind of like I mentioned a moment ago, I actually am not sure what the best way to go about that is, because I haven't gotten that note in this way ever or in a long time. Let's think about what you're really asking for. Let's find the essence of what you're really asking for, and let's explore what some different options might be. Let me show you some ideas that are beginning to come to mind when I take the pressure off myself and allow my imagination to run wild. And let me show you 2 or 3 ideas and let you select the best one. There's nothing that will turn a difficult client into a fun client faster than feeling like they're being invited to participate and to play a meaningful role in crafting the shape of the image. We tend to have this assumption that the client wants us to give them the answer straight away. Sometimes they do, and if they do and they don't like your exploratory mode and they think you're too slow, that's okay. Maybe they're not going to call you back. And by the way, that's okay too. You don't want to walk around pissing off clients, but not every client who walks into your room is going to be a repeat customer. So that's okay too. But more often than a client going like, oh, that guy or that gal was unbearable. They made me sit there while we explored different options that they were clearly turned on by, and they wanted to find the best one for my vision. Most of the time, they're going to think that's super cool. And they're going to feel like they have a better ability to collaborate with a colorist the next time around. And they're going to be that much more likely to call you. So some additional thoughts about dealing with difficult grades and doing so in connection with difficult clients. And I could talk about this aspect of things all day, but those are just some of the thoughts that kind of sprung to mind as I was chewing on this subject this week. And I'm going to take a breather, sip some coffee, and see what we've got out there in terms of questions on this subject.
All right, let's go to the questions. And we have this one from Kogeki TV. How can you describe your choices about contrast? How to feel correct when it's too much or not enough? I mean, cases when you can ask your DP or anybody. And Jean Robinson added to this question. Why do we always add contrast but rarely pull it out? If the background has less contrast, will it not help to make the subject pop more?
Oh, I'm getting some deja vu here. I think, in fact, I know we covered those 2 questions at the end of our last session. And Rafa, that's my fault for not updating our Google Doc where we keep everyone's questions straight. So we can, for any of you guys who are here today who weren't here last week, who heard those questions and went, ooh, those are things that are fun to discuss, check out Grade School of last week. We covered them both. Let's see what else we got out here. We can check out, I don't know if there's anything live in that document there, Rafa. So let's see if anybody's got any ideas here in the chat. And if not, then let me know and I'm just going to keep rambling.
All right. So I have a question. So is there a point on adding sharpness / blur in other color models / spaces like linear light or HSV?
Yeah, really good question. So that's one that I haven't explored in full myself, but I can tell you the exploration that I have done is doing that stuff in a linear tone curve. So leaving it in the RGB color model, but linearizing the image, that gets you way better results for sure. Because my hunch is that it's because your top end occupies more space and your bottom end occupies less space, and it seems to really make a material difference. So that would be one easy upgrade that we can make right off the bat. I mean, let me just quickly demo something out here. Let's look at, let me get my tablet woken up and let's get up on my resolve screen here. And let's look at this image. So I've got a little bit of vibe going on here. Let's input map this image. So this happens to be a red wide gamut RGB image, and I am running right now through an Alexa to 709 transform because I tend to work quite a bit just in Alexa log C as my working space, regardless of what my actual camera was. So I'm going to set an input transform from red wide gamut RGB log 3 G10 to Area Alexa log C. No tone mapping. White point can stay on. No EOTF or OOTF stuff. So we're going to do that. And let me just check my project settings as well, because since I'm manually color managing, I need to make sure that these settings are appropriately set, which they are. And then I'm just going to double check that I've built out the rest of my pipeline in a sensible form here. Nothing else going on there. I've been bouncing between projects quite a bit, so I want to make sure I'm properly oriented here, which I now am. Although I have to say, I don't love how this is looking. Oh, there we go. Double transform. Okay, so I did not need that piece, which makes sense because it looked better before I did anything at all. All right, so back to the subject. Let's talk about some sharpening. Let's do this. I'm going to zoom in, and let's just, this is going to be a little tricky over our web broadcast, but I think we'll be able to see a little bit of something, okay? So let's try a couple different things. We could do, for example, let's say we just want to soften out some of that texture on our subject's forehead. I could do -25 on my midtone detail. And you can see that kind of flipping off and on there. Let's go really hard with it just so it's super easy to spot. So that's like -100, that looks ridiculous. Here's -75, probably still not a terribly sensible portion size of midtone detail. But let's check this out. For me, I've set my timeline color space up correctly, so I can use a little shortcut where otherwise I would need to use some color space transforms on either side of this node to move from area Alexa log C into area Alexa linear, do this operation, and then move from area Alexa linear back to area log C. I can actually do all of that within this node by right-clicking and going to gamma and saying linear, like so. So look what happened the moment I did that. I've still got the softness, but I've maintained a different level of sharpness in there as well. So textural operations, blurring and sharpening, really, really good candidates for applying in a linear tone curve. Now, the other portion of Rafa's question about like, oh, could it be interesting to sharpen your channels in something like an HSV or a LCH or some other kind of color model? That would be an interesting thing to play around with that, frankly, I never have, but we should do some R&D on that. Maybe me and my grade school gang will do that this week and we can report our findings back this week. Or if any of you guys out there want to tackle it, then I'd love to hear about it. But as a starting point, applying sharpness or softness in a linear tone curve, that's like normally the way I will do that operation. I'll put it that way, just because I like the net effects of doing it here, like so. Like look at her eyes here versus that. This just feels more imposed, and this version feels a little more resolute, and just like I am modulating the modulation transfer function, the overall sharpness of my like rough, coarse, and fine details in the image.
All right, let's go to live questions. This one is from Christopher Mahoney. How do you communicate politely, of course, that the client's expectations are not realistic?
Yeah, really good question. Really good, especially when it comes to difficult clients, because that can certainly be a source of difficulty in a collaboration when like we just talked quite a bit about our expectations, but if their expectations aren't properly calibrated, that can be tough as well, can it? It depends. There are some, it depends on the person, and it depends on their relationship to the work. Some people have the right personality and they have the right relationship to the work that you can just tell them, hey, I have to be honest with you, I think you're asking for something that your footage really doesn't support. That's possible. I have clients like that who trust me to just give them the unvarnished truth when that's the reality. I would say that's a rarity. Most of the time, we have to kind of tiptoe around that. And here would be the way that I will frame it, that is not a lie, it's just a lens on the conversation. I will put it this way. I am carrying the subtext in my back pocket all the time when I'm working with clients, that I have zero interest in taking their image and recontorting it so that it feels like someone else's image. I'm happy to take inspiration from other stuff that looks great, but I'm constantly carrying the subtext and sort of injecting into the way that I speak the notion that my goal is to take their image and make it look more like itself, if that makes sense. So it would be the equivalent of like, I'm about to be a dad, so I'm thinking about my kid a lot, and I'm thinking about the fact that I don't expect my kid to love this color science stuff as much as I do. And I don't want to make her love this color science stuff. I want to pay attention to her and see what she's into. And if she's into mountain climbing or needlepoint or whatever she's into, I want to be really sensitive to that and pay attention to it and notice when that interest is expressed, and then kindle and encourage and stimulate that passion and that interest. Same kind of thing with the image. I'm constantly looking in whatever I'm grading. Part of my job, part of what I'm being paid for, is to pay really close attention to what I'm seeing in the image and to be like looking at what's special about it, what's unique about it, what's beautiful about it, such that when this conversation comes up about like, whatever the case may be, like you're asking me to throw a film print level of contrast on this image, but you didn't light with enough fill light, so the contrast ratio just looks out of control. Easy example. I'm not going to frame the language in that way. What I'm going to try to do at those moments, what I'm going to try to have ready at those moments, is real and true and insightful observations about what's great about this material, rather than emphasizing, hey, this thing that we are pursuing seems to be bumping directly into the weakness of your image. I'm going to try to pivot the conversation and say, I got to tell you, I think this is a blind alley. I think we are completely losing sight of this thing that I think is really magical about your footage. And if you want to do this, that's fine. Or maybe we back this off a little bit, but I think we should focus on that. So a lot of it for me is about pivoting things from what the perceived weaknesses are of the material to where the material is really exceptional and really strong, and letting the client be smart enough to recognize, like, okay, without me ever needing to even directly say anything, potentially, like that in my hypothetical, that film print level of contrast really isn't serving the image well. They're going to notice sooner or later, all the more so if I don't rub it in their face that they don't have the proper contrast ratio from their negative to really pull it off. They're going to notice somewhere along the way. And even if they don't, then we've still done the best thing we can, which is to look for the positives and best serve them. And if they want that thing that the footage really doesn't support, I'll do my best to implement it and I'll call it a day. Generally speaking, by the time the grade is done, your client is going to notice the things that don't serve their image well. It may just take them a little bit longer than you do. So kind of a two-parter there. Be ready to talk about what's exceptional and the strengths you want to enhance, as opposed to the weaknesses you feel like you're running into. And then the other part of that would be trusting that things you may not feel are working, you don't need to pull them out of the stack and get them out of the way on your timeline. Just because you recognize them now doesn't mean they won't recognize them in 10 minutes or an hour and ask you to pull them out all on their own. Trust your client to make good decisions in the long run if you're patient with them and you engage with them collaboratively.
All right, another question regarding this collaboration session. How do you make sure remote clients are seeing what you're seeing? Not having control of your client's screen seems pretty challenging.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's one of the first things that I'll go to when I hear feedback that doesn't quite make sense to me. Like, wait, you think that looks too contrasty? I haven't even touched anything yet. Like we have to be vigilant and exploratory about that aspect, because it is tough to nail down. But I would say, like, the prevailing wisdom there, honestly, it's that same, what I find to be an endlessly difficult and frustrating piece of advice: lower your expectations. It's not gonna, I promise you, no client that I've worked with this year has been looking at an image that's dead on identical to what I'm looking at in any grade. So my expectations get lowered a little bit, and that causes me to grade a little bit differently. That's going to cause me at a starting point, I'm going to grade a little bit more conservatively. And I'm also going to try to carry, again, like I keep referring to this idea of carrying subtext in your back pocket. I want to keep ideas sort of in the air that I don't necessarily need to explicitly state. The same way that, like if you think about the way that actors work and the way directors direct actors, directors will give an actor an imaginative cue that isn't in the dialogue. They'll say, like, you may be, telling your spouse that you're leaving them, but I'm going to give you the hypothetical scenario. I want you to deliver that news as if it's the best news in the world. Just a silly example. Okay. That's the same kind of thing that I mean when I say I'm carrying subtext. I mean, I'm trying to keep the ideas and messaging that is important to me, that I think is going to best support our collaboration, in my back pocket and look for little subtextual ways to kind of drop those into the dialogue without them ever being explicitly stated. And one such subtext that I was alluding to just now is to try to carry around the subtext that like, hey, you're not in the room with me. I guarantee you didn't spend the money on your reference monitor that I did. You're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to trust that the best monitor in this Zoom session is my monitor, which means that you're going to have to rely kind of one part on what you're seeing and one part on what I am telling you. Again, that's not a message that I would ever explicitly state, and certainly not in that way, but that's a subtext that I'm carrying around in my back pocket that I try to let kind of bleed into all of our interactions when we are over Zoom sessions. And then on the more practical side, when I am in a remote session, I almost never will begin grading the first shot before just getting a reality check on everyone and framing things in the context of like, hey, since I know we all care a ton about this grade and we all want to get the very best out of our time together, I just want to make sure we're all looking at the same image. And because I want to make sure we're all looking at the same image, I want to ask you guys a couple questions. What are you looking at this on and where are you? And I'll basically suggest, if nothing else, most people are going to be at least on like a MacBook Pro or an iPad, and that's actually not a bad device. Those are pretty good devices for critical color evaluation. So I will just ask them, okay, can you set your brightness to around 50-60% for me? And I want you to make sure of two things. There is no light source anywhere in your space that is directly hitting your screen or directly hitting your eyes. That's a very like loose prescription. There's a much more rigid prescription that, for example, I apply in my grading suite. Well, we need to have D65 lighting and we need to have, like an 18% gray wall behind my hero reference monitor. And that monitor needs to be tightly calibrated. All these things that like, I can't, that's not a realistic prescription to give to the people that I'm sitting in a Zoom session with, but I can give that sort of basic prescription of like, all right, what are you looking at this on? And if they come back and say, oh, I'm looking at it on, like my consumer TV that I'm running an HDMI feed out of my laptop onto, that's another opportunity where I can gently suggest, hey, you know what? That totally makes sense. I would want to see the image nice and large as well. I have to tell you, I don't think you're going to have much of a chance at seeing what I'm seeing if you make that choice. So why don't we instead just deal with looking at things on that smaller laptop screen because it's going to be more accurate. And then once we confirm, okay, we're on a MacBook, we're on an iPad, we're on some sort of reasonably accurate device, just do that gut check of saying, hey, set your brightness to around 50-60%. Make sure there's a low level of ambient light. Make sure there is no light directly hitting your eyes or directly hitting the screen. And that will get you at least into a meaningful reference, a meaningfully close relationship between what you're looking at in your grading environment and what your client is looking at in theirs. And then even with all those things, as I said, you're going to have to be vigilant all the way throughout and pay attention to if you're getting feedback that really doesn't square with any way you would describe your image. You want to, just be willing to say like, hey, I have to tell you, based on what I'm hearing from you versus what I'm looking at on my monitor, I feel like we might need to take a second look at what we're all viewing this on and make sure that that's buttoned up and that we're making best use of our time, if that makes sense.
Okay. This question comes from Sasha Fefiria. And as a colorist, how many retakes do you allow after sending the version 1 of your grade? Or do you even put a limit to that?
Yes, I do. Good question. And if you want to hear more about this, you can check out the 2 installments of Essential Business Skills for Colorists. But to very briefly summarize that, everything that I do estimates for, the scale is in passes. So I will there's a set number of hours attached to that, but I don't really hold. What I've found in my experience over the years is like it's pretty tough for me to say, well, I told you, hypothetical scenario, I told you that I would do 3 passes through this color grade for a total of 30 hours, let's say. And I have ended up spending 37 hours and I want you to pay the difference. I've spent 37 hours on those 3 passes. That's not really fair to the client because what the hell control do they have over that process? Unless you're in the room and they're insisting, no, we're not done. We need to go further. And there's a clear communication where you're like, hey, we're running over what we've allotted. And I just want to make sure everyone's cool with some overage before we proceed. Unless it's that scenario, to just say, hey, when I turned around and went and did my work, it took me more time than what I estimated to you. That's not really fair, or it certainly doesn't feel fair to the client to pass that along, but passes do feel pretty equitable to say. So that varies per project, and that's a key negotiation point when I'm doing estimates and getting approvals, is I'll say, all right, I think we can do this in 3 passes. I usually won't say fewer than 3 passes, and that will be the way that I scale hours up, is hours will scale, but really what that means to the client is I'll say, okay, so it sounds like you've got some really detailed notes, and you may need to, for example, maybe you're going to want to go through the grade, give your notes, make your approvals, and then and only then you're going to need to actually kick it up to your boss or to your client to get their approval. And they may want to make changes themselves at that point. That's a classic example where just automatically, as soon as I hear that, as soon as I'm asking about workflow and I hear that being discussed, I'm going to change the approach. I'm going to say, okay, cool. We're going to add 2 passes for that because we have to plan for the worst. And that's another good principle for, to go back to the doing estimates part of the business. We have this like sort of fear of wanting to make our estimate as low as possible so we don't scare the client away. We actually should make it as high as we think it might get, because everyone's fired up to save money. Nobody is fired up to be billed $1 extra over what you gave the estimate for. So even though an estimate is just an estimate and we shouldn't really be held to the exact dollar amount, in my experience, that really is what we are doing. If you submit an estimate for $1,000 and you bill $1,001, they're going to wonder who made a mistake. And because no one wants to be the person who makes mistakes, they're going to accuse you of making a mistake, and then they're going to ask you to pay for that mistake. So in general, you want to account for, hey, if you're going to give 3 rounds of notes and then you're going to kick it to your client, and I haven't even met them, I don't even know what their input's going to be, 2 passes are getting added on. If we don't use those 2 passes, awesome. You get some walker, you get to save some money at the end of the process. But I'm going to bid for the worst case scenario where if there's going to be multiple stakeholders giving notes at multiple points, we need to increase the overall number of passes. So short answer, yes, there's a set number of passes. It varies per project, and it's a very open point of conversation when we are in the process of doing estimates and getting a job approved before it begins.
All right, let's step aside from the top clients for a moment. And Depender wants to know, what are your thoughts on working with power windows and saturation adjustment in a linear node? And also, he wants to know if it's a good idea to use the RGB mixer also within a linear space to compress hues and adjust RGB density to create certain color palette and looks.
Oh man, Depender's been doing his homework. Those are good questions. So let's tackle those kind of as briefly as we can. So let's talk about power windows and saturation in linear tone curve. I'm going to give you guys, spoiler alert, I think this was one of the first things that I came out swinging about when grade school started up early in 2021. I'm a big fan of working in linear. I will put it to you this way. I've done a number of projects this year in linear, where like the exception is that I'm moving into log for something, but I love working like end to end in linear. There's a lot of stuff that just works better. I mean, let's do kind of the similar experiment to what we just did with our softening adjustment. Let's go over here to Isabella where we've got some more color patches, and let's do kind of a crazy or a exaggerated amount of saturation here. Let's do like a 65, okay? And we can do our same experiment. Let's like zoom in a little bit, look at her face, look at the patches over here as well. And let's just do exactly what I did a moment ago. Let's just move this into linear. So we can see the net results there. In this case, I'm having less effect. My yellow is kind of moving on a different vector. So I think of it linear saturation, like at least in this case, at least on this image under this look stack, I actually like the log saturation better. I can definitely tell you there are instances where the opposite is true. So I would think of that more as like a sort of creative option that we can elect for at any point. It's like, hey, I wonder what this would look like in linear. And especially if you've got a pipeline set up like mine is, it's literally as easy as going in and saying, oh, let's do a linear gamma. See how that feels. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. In my case, I don't love what's happening here. I don't love what's happening in my foliage, and I like the gold highlight better that I had initially. So it's not a winner for me in this particular case, but it's something I'll play with all the time for sure. Power windows in linear, absolutely. Like if we think about my go-to suggestion that I make to you guys a lot of like dropping exposure. Let's find a good image to audition this on. Let's just do like some negative fill over here. I could do a power window, like a straight up vertical grad, like so, and sort of frame the fill side of her face here, like so. Let's open it up, walk it over, soften it out a little bit, and I can once again just flip my gamma over to linear. And let's say we just want to knock this down a little bit, like so. That's pretty aggressive, but that's cool. Let's turn that off and on. So that's probably needs to be softened out a little bit and probably needs to be backed off somewhat. But for any kind of like what we would call dodging in like traditional laboratory like photo processing, I'm a big fan of dodging in linear because I can just work my game and expose things down. If I weren't in linear, I would get quite similar results by working my offset. Let's reset that, and I could also do this with offset. But offset, as we've talked about before, is actually going to subtly change behavior depending on what curve we are in, even within different log curves, which is why I like linear, because linear is always going to do the exact same thing, and it's not going to be dependent on the log curve that I happen to be operating in. So that's another example where I would use that. And I had one other thing I was going to add to that conversation, which is slipping my mind at the moment. Maybe it'll come back to me. So there's that piece. And then we wanted to talk about the RGB mixer as well. So RGB mixer, for the applications that you're talking about, there were a bunch that were listed in there of like adding density and some other pieces that are not coming to mind straight away. But a lot of the pieces that are being talked about are manipulations that happen on like that take place in curves, like they're done with curves of some sort. A matrix, which is what the RGB mixer is, works in straight lines. Now, applying it in a linear tone curve is, again, I would almost state that like the math of an RGB mixer is a 3x3 matrix, and a 3x3 matrix, the simplest, most fundamental implementation of a 3x3 matrix would be in a linear tone curve. So short answer, yes, that is absolutely a valid thing. And we could once again just flip our gamma over here to linear like so, and just experiment with the results that we get by operating here in linear space versus operating in log space. And you could just compare. And, like I'm kind of just freehanding my wheels right now without an articulate goal in mind. But if I did have a goal, I could try my best to accomplish it with an RGB mixer in linear, and then try my best to accomplish it with an RGB mixer in log and see what I get and see which one I prefer. That's a big part of working with these kind of tools, is just evaluating, like staging shootouts, basically, of saying like, all right, I'm trying to do X. Does X work better with this methodology or technique, or with that methodology or technique, or this other one? Kind of, line up your candidates and have a shootout. That's a really fun process. In this case, as I said, I'm just kind of like freewheeling here. But yes, absolutely. Using the RGB mixer in a linear gamma curve is a totally valid thing to do. And in fact, it should almost be what we think of as the default normal way of implementing an RGB matrix. And the last thing that I'll say about everything that I've just talked about, which is what I slipped my mind for a moment ago, I should say, is everything that I just talked about, I probably wouldn't do if I didn't have my workflow set up in such a way that I could just kick into linear with a single switch. If I was having to make sandwiches every single time here, even if I had a sandwich saved off over here to go area Alexa log C to area Alexa linear, do the thing, and then go from area Alexa linear to area Alexa log C, I probably would skip it a lot just because I don't have time, especially if we think about being in a live session with the clients that we were talking about earlier. They're not paying for me to sit there and set up color space transform nodes. They've got no interest or patience in that, nor should they. So a lot of this comes down to workflow. Like if you have expeditious ways of implementing these things, then you can use them. And if you don't, then there's not the benefits don't outweigh the cost, I would say. So just a a final addendum there, but that would be some of my thoughts on those. Very good questions. Someone has been studying up on color science and pushing the craft. Good on you, Depender.
All right, let's go to maybe another question from Depender. You have talked about highlight tone mapping and highlight texture on podcast with Toby Tompkins. Can you explain what exactly it is and how can we start seeing that in any grade we see?
Ooh, good question. Yeah. So I'm going to point you guys, help me remember. Someone leave me a comment if I don't proactively do this, but there's a great series of videos that the Baselight team put out a couple years ago when they released their texture equalizer tool that, of course, demonstrates the way that tool works, which we don't have an exact analog for in Resolve, although the texture pop tool is close. But these videos, more than showing you, oh, look at this great tool that you have to have Baselight to make use of, they do a great job of breaking down something that Toby and I talked about in that podcast and that I talk with Toby about all the time, which is your Mtf curve. And I even mentioned that earlier in today's session. Basically thinking about the spatial component of your image, the texture, the sharpness, the softness, and how that changes as your texture goes from rough to more fine detailed. So that's kind of what we were talking about on there. And there's all kinds of ways to think about that, just like most aspects of color grading. We can think about halation as a form of changing our highlight texture detail. We can think about, like insider info here. You guys may or may not know that my highlights slider here, which is designed to have a pretty narrow control over the top end of my image. We can see it represented if I turn my transforms off. We can see that that's, designed to have a fairly narrow control over the top of my image, a bit more of a bowing effect than we would get with something like our gain. In addition to performing this operation on the image tonally, it's actually going to be softening out or changing the texture of those highlights. So this is actually a way of working with highlight texture right here within Resolve. And to be honest with you, trying to remember, I want to say negative highlights equals positive sharpness. I think we're going to get more texture as we pull highlights in and more softness as we punt them the other way, but don't quote me on that. All I can tell you off the top of my head is that the highlight knob definitely affects the texture as well as the tonality of our image. That's another way of thinking about highlight texture and like spatial relationships there. But that's really what we're talking about when we describe that, is that like the character, like, put it this way, we've talked plenty here in grade school, and I've talked in lots of other outlets about like, hey, if you had one tool to match, for example, the character of a film print, if you're like, all right, if you could only do one simple operation to match that character, I know what my pick would be. My pick would be, well, let's get that characteristic curve. Let's get that big deep toe, that slightly above zero black point, that big rolling, sweeping, creamy shoulder that dies somewhere above 100% luminance. Let's get that. That's far from everything that makes a film print feel like a film print, but it's the biggest single piece in terms of the way the viewer is going to experience it. So we've talked a lot about that, about like that's one of the characteristic elements of modeling a film print. But when we start to get into MTF, and what you'll see if you check out that Baselight video that I'll send you guys a link to, is you can actually think of your MTF curve as a way of characterizing or sort of like manipulating your image. You can actually look at, okay, what's the MTF curve of this image right here, right now, versus the MTF curve of this frame from To Catch a Thief, or whatever the reference point is. And we can actually figure out like what is the MTF curve of these different images, and we can like model and mimic MTF curves or shape them in a creative way to get more advantageous results. So some kind of open-ended thoughts about highlight texture and MTF. And the last thing that I would point out is that for those of us who are not working in HDR all the time or at all of this stuff makes much more like intuitive sense the moment you look at an HDR image. And in fact, like something that I talk about all the time with HDR, the biggest challenge to me with HDR is because there is so much snap there's so much dynamic range built into that image that like, I'll put it to you this way. When I'm grading in HDR and I've been in SDR and I'm flipping back over to HDR for the first time in a while, one of the like paralyzing things that happens to me when I look at an HDR image is I'm like, I actually don't know if it's too sharp or it has too much contrast. Those things are obviously related even in an SDR situation. And I think Toby and I might have even talked about this in the podcast episode that Depender is referencing. But when I'm working in HDR, I often have trouble, or I stop to think about, wait, do I need this? Do I need a softer MTF, or do I need a softer contrast curve, or both? Because the two are far more intertwined in an HDR master than in an SDR. And that's kind of a tangent, but point being, like, all of this business about highlight texture makes much more intuitive tactile sense when you are looking at an image on an HDR display. So even if you just, like, say you don't have an X300 lying around, go, like, if you don't have an HDR TV in your living room, go pick one up, even if it's not the perfect one, and just try to observe what I'm talking about on a, like, broadcast HDR image, and go like, oh, wow, the way those highlights ping up there makes the whole image feel sharper. And as a result, we may want to shape the sharpness or softness of some or all of the image in order to sort of calibrate a nice balance point between sharpness and, like, sort of dreaminess, which of course is going to depend on our tastes and our creative goals. Bunch of thoughts about highlight texture.
All right, let's go back to the client stuff. Cool. I had a question, but I missed. I don't see it. So, okay, there we go. This question comes from DJ Joy. One scenario: you supply material that is poor quality. Some of those clips with effort, can you make it half decent? But almost everything just looks bad, whatever you do. But the director is happy, but you're not. What happens to your reputation? What do you do in those situations?
Oh man, that's the big kid questions right there. I'm really glad we asked that question. That's one that definitely comes up all the time. So I'm gonna see if I can find here we go. I'm just gonna read that question out once more for myself. So you're supplied material that's poor quality. Some you can, with effort, make half decent. Some clips just look bad, whatever you do. Director is happy, you're not. Your reputation, so what happens to your reputation? Yeah, boy, really good question. So one of the things I'm really excited about that I'm going to tip you guys off about right now, I've got an ebook coming out that's about, like, what I'm going to call the 10 commandments of color grading, the stuff that, all else aside, no matter what we're grading, the things that we have to keep in mind, the top level principles that we really need to keep in mind at all times when we're grading. One of those principles is this one: first, do no harm. Okay? So this sounds, again, like this kind of relates to, in the context I'm going to share it with you, my lower your expectations idea. In that situation, you know what your main job is to do? Don't make it worse. And it sounds like in the way the question is being phrased that you've got a good understanding of that like the best thing you can do is know when to stop. Like, same thing. You get whatever level your images come in at, your material comes in at, that's going to dictate the best it can ever be. If the image is not as high quality at the outset, it's going to mean you can do less with it, right? So in those situations, the worst thing you can do is try to treat all images the same and try to treat them all like they're going to look like Dune or Sicario or something like that. They're not going to. There is no way you are ever going to get them to look that way. If you press your luck, you can make them look worse than they started. That's always possible, but you cannot change or fundamentally reconstitute an image. So all that is to say, lower those expectations like we started, and remember that the rule that your first obligation with those kinds of images or any kind of images is to make sure that not a single thing you do makes any aspect of that image look worse. So that's a different question. If you're being asked to do things that you feel are making the image actually look worse, that gets hairier. And that's where you need to really start to break out some of your soft interpersonal skills and start to gently, and then in some cases more firmly, push back and say, hey, I got to tell you, I'm not sure this is the best direction for this image. I actually like what you had better than what we currently are looking at. And that's again where you can invoke that principle of being like, hey, I think you have a better looking image than you thought. I think we need to do less to your image, frame it in a positive context. But that's the first piece. We want to make sure that we are doing no harm, which it sounds like based on the question you understand, and in that hypothetical scenario, it's not that we're making it worse, it's that we're not making it better enough, if that to make an awkward turn of phrase. So in that situation, the same tip that we started our conversation with today, just lower your expectations. If you're not making it look worse and the director is happy, don't worry about your reputation. It's natural to worry about that, but you're going to work on all kinds of material. Some of it's going to look great. Some of it's not going to look as great. I quoted, I can't remember where I brought up this quote recently, but it did come to mind recently. Maybe it was in grade school. I can't remember. I'm clearly talking about color grading too much. There's a great line in the movie Michael Clayton, one of my favorite movies. Tony Gilroy, writer-director, George Clooney, and a great turn from Tom Wilkinson as well. But there's a great line in Michael Clayton where he's like, the math on this is simple. I'm a janitor. The bigger the mess, the smaller the mess, the easier it is for me to clean up. And that's the reality when we're color grading. If you give me a lower quality image, that's going to set the ceiling of how far I can take it for you. Maybe I can take it farther than a slightly less skilled colorist might, but I'm not going to be able to take it as far as if you'd given me a great image. That's just the reality. And it's another weird sort of pressure that we impose on ourselves, and sometimes our clients impose on us too, that somehow you are this magical black box that no matter what goes into the box, out comes the same caliber of image. That's not realistic. That's not reasonable. So it's helpful to remember in these scenarios, hey, the image that comes out of here is not going to be as strong as it might if I were being fed something better. And that's okay. And that's not going to confer judgment upon me as a colorist. That just means I'm a working colorist. And the reality is if you do 100 jobs next year, only one of those jobs is going to be the best looking one, and the rest are going to look slightly worse. So none of that necessarily means that you are going to be judged for it or that you're not doing your job correctly. That's just the reality of working with images of different quality and caliber coming from different filmmakers. And let's try one or two more before we wrap up our session today here.
All right. This one comes from Albert Carhu. Any real-world examples of tough clients? What are those things they ask for when they tell you they want this or that?
Well, I would say to some extent names have to be changed to protect the guilty. So I won't share any particularly specific or juicy gossip with you guys, but I would say the umbrella that I can put almost any problematic or difficult client request under would be that I'm being asked to go too far. I'm being asked to do too much. Whether that's too much in service of oh, the image is noisy. Can you denoise it? Yeah, we can denoise it. But I'm being asked to iron it out and make it look like a plastic figurine. It's a question of how far I'm being asked to go with something. Or similarly, let's say we're doing I gave this example earlier, a film print type of look, a really strong film print look. And I'm being asked, I'll put it to you guys this way, just as a sort of anecdotal aside. There are very few images that are well served by a full strength, true film print level of contrast. That's a lot of contrast. And in my opinion, really the only way to pull it off in an elegant way that best serves the images, that works for the images and for the story, is to shoot with that curve somewhat in mind. So just a common scenario that comes through my door a lot is if you're shooting on an Alexa and you're shooting under the K1 S1 LUT and you're making your lighting decisions under that stock LUT, and then you come to me and you want to go full strength film print curve, that's a great example of a perfectly valid idea and a perfectly serviceable idea that I'm going to push back harder and harder on in terms of going all the way. So that's one where I might be being asked to go too far further in a direction that I'm comfortable. And so a lot of the time it's not oh, that's a dumb request. I can't do that for you. It's more like, hey, let me just audition for you something. How does 2/3 feel? How does 50% feel? How little of this can we get away with and still get the flavor that you want without incurring the compromises and the costs that I see on your behalf that I think you're going to not be happy with in the long run? So it's a lot of question of like whether we're fixing something or imposing a look or, like trying to relight something, all kinds of scenarios that come up. But fundamentally, for me, almost any difficult, quote unquote, feedback or grade that I can think of is a question of needing to align our expectations of how far something should optimally go to get best results, if that makes sense, whether it's corrective or creative in nature. And it's about trying to figure out like, okay, how can we get a little bit better aligned in terms of seeing the same thing in terms of like, well, we can go to 60%, but 100% is not 40% better than 60%. There's a cliff edge there to any operation, whether that's denoise or, like bringing up someone's face with a power window or anything else. There's a cliff edge. And if you go past that, you haven't gone 70% further in the intuitive sense. You've made it worse. You've broken things. You've like driven your car off the edge of a cliff. So that would be kind of the idea that I would say there is that we want to calibrate how far we want to take something versus like, how far is the maximum that affords the benefit that we are looking for our image. And let's take one more question and wrap it up there. Give me a good one, Raf.
Oh,
They've all been good ones today. You guys have had great questions. I'm glad we're talking about this subject.
Let's talk about the Blitz Bypass. What can you tell us about it? That's the question.
Oh boy. Bleach bypass, I'm gonna do a thing I don't often do with you guys. I'm gonna sort of demur on that question. I'm actually in the process of learning from a person who I consider to be a true mentor, who's really teaching me about bleach bypass in a much more nuanced way than I have thought about it before. And I'm right in the midst of that learning process, so I don't feel like I'm going to be an excellent teacher of these concepts yet. Bleach bypass in broadest strokes, of course, as we all know, and probably the person asking that question knows, more contrast, less saturation. Like that's the sort of like gross visual character of the thing. But of course, it speaks to an actual photochemical process and to a photochemical process that can be deployed in different ways. And if you guys remind me, probably by next week or the week after, I will have a better grasp on that and feel like I can really succinctly and accurately characterize the actual photochemical process that underlies that. It's funny because I've got like a really good bleach bypass model roughed out in a DCTL right now that's more photochemically accurate than like anything else that's on the market right now. But it's mostly the result of me like feverishly listening to the person I'm talking about say like, well, then this is what would happen. And then that's what would happen. And I'm literally just typing out math as they go along, but I've yet to like sort of synthesize that into a simple and succinct type of explanation, which is usually what I want to give to you guys. So great question that I'm going to hold off on answering for now, but remind me about it in another week or two. And I'll be very excited to share what I've learned very recently about bleach bypass in the most detailed and photochemical sense of that term, as opposed to just, oh, it's a look with lots of contrast and low saturation. I don't think any of us need that sort of like vague level of precision answer to the question. It would be much more fun to have a more detailed one. So I'll have that one for you guys very soon. And now let's do one. Do we have another good one out there, Raphael? If not, we can call it here.
Well, we have a question from Jim Robinson, and this is one that's very curious. Cullen, do you ever study oil painting texture techniques for applying depth in color grading?
Yes, I do. Not as much as I ought to, but like as so many filmmakers are inspired by, like I'm hugely inspired by oil painting and the texture and the color separation and the way that light is rendered and dimension is rendered in two-dimensional space. I think it's an incredibly valuable fountain of information because we can borrow a lot of that stuff in the color characteristic and get a sense of the color harmonies that are being used. Like that's another one that we don't talk a ton about, but like, the color theory of things and the way that we create, harmonies and separation with the palette of our images. Obviously, the difference for us is we're not painting those images from the beginning, so we're not selecting our palette from zero, but being aware of those things and being versed in paintings and art that you love. Yes, absolutely. And this is kind of a tangent, but like one of the artists who I study most thoroughly at this point is a very strange, wonderful artist from the early 20th century called William Mortensen. William Mortensen was a photographer who rendered, and this was all obviously way before anything digital, who had an unbelievable ability to make his photographs feel painted or illustrated. So if any of you guys are curious about one particularly fruitful fountain of, like non-cinema visual art that I find really inspiring, William Mortensen's a great place to start. Fair warning, not safe for work at all. William Mortensen was a weird dude with some weird concepts in a lot of his work, but it's disturbing and evocative and fascinating and otherworldly stuff that I highly encourage checking out. So that's a tangent off of Jim's very good question, but I feel like we could talk for a whole hour just about like what are some of the most fascinating like sort of reference points from other visual arts. The other one that comes to mind for me that is common for a lot of filmmakers is Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper had an amazing ability to work with light and color and composition in a way that a lot of cinematographers still go like, oh, that's what we're doing. They'll use it as a reference when they're photographing something because the way that he designed and photographed and harmonized the colors in his paintings was so exceptional. So yeah, good question. And you've got me thinking about in this holiday mode of being a little bit less hectic for the next couple of weeks here. This is a good interval to go back and explore some paintings and other non-film forms of visual art anew and find some new inspiration. And Jim, I'd love to hear what you're into and any of you other guys who are inspired by these other art forms. That would be a great conversation to have, and like leave a comment on the video here or in some other community post and just let me know like what you guys dig, and maybe that'd be a fun conversation sometime of like places where we can steal inspiration and what we can steal from them for our craft as motion image storytellers. And that is a great place to wrap us up for today. Super great to see all you guys as always. Great conversation, great questions. I hope you got some new ideas from what we talked about, some new techniques or ways of thinking about things, and excited to pick up with y'all next week in the next episode of Grade School. And as I keep alluding to, I promise I'm not just blowing smoke, exciting stuff coming early in 2022 that I know you guys are all going to be really pumped up about. At least I hope you will, because I am. So more announcements about that stuff coming very soon. I hope everyone's had a chance to check out the Low Post podcast. The first episode came out last week with Mr. Eric White, phenomenal colorist. We got another one coming out on Sunday. I don't know who is up next, but it's one of the 8 amazing guests I had, so you can't miss. They're all going to be great. Check that out, and I think that's all the news fit to print for now. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your Friday, great rest of your weekend. Have a great week next week, and I will see you next Friday for Grade School. And thanks to Raphael, as always, for co-hosting with me. See you guys all very soon.